Hello, and welcome to Eras of Western Women, a limited CFD podcast. During these 4 episodes, Cheyenne Frontier Days celebrates 2024 as the Year of the Cowgirl. I'm Diane Schober, Executive Director at the Wyoming Office of Tourism. I'm a lifelong mega fan of Cheyenne Frontier Days and a proud host of this podcast series.
A part of Western history, a legend walked the talk. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy of all.
Joining me today is Mike Castle. Mike is the Associate Director and Curator of Collections at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. During these upcoming 4 episodes, we'll celebrate the Year of the Cowgirl and the eras of women from diverse backgrounds who've made history in our Western way of life. So, Mike, in this episode, we'll be talking about the prominent women who've shaped Wyoming and the West and history during the 1800 to 1895 timeframe. Why don't you kick us off from the very beginning and share a little bit of your vast knowledge about these women in the West?
Well, thank you, Diane. It's nice to join you here today. This is a fun topic. We talk about this in Wyoming history. Of course, we talk about how women have impacted the experience of the West from the very beginning. It informs what Cheyenne Frontier Days becomes. But if you take a look back at history, it would be the general person on the street would not have a very easy time coming up with the earliest female history hero that we have in our entire story. But unless you tell them about the Corps of Discovery with Lewis and Clark. It's fortunately through Lewis and Clark and that wonderful adventure that they had back at the turn of the 19th century that they ran into a remarkable young woman that was able to do things that no one else would have been able to do and contributed mightily to the success of their whole adventure.
I think someone that, if you're interested at all in American history, and this is a woman who really was very, very profound in what happened during her time frame. Sacajawea.
Sacajawea, absolutely. Well, Sacajawea is an amazing young lady, even for what she experienced before she met Lewis and Clark on that very fateful summer. She was a young Lemhi Shoshone woman who was in the area of northern Wyoming and Idaho, but was captured by the Hidatsa Indians and was taken as a slave to the Mandan village in North Dakota, where Lewis and Clark would eventually meet her. And here she is torn away from her family, never thinks she's going to see them again, and then put into an interesting situation where she is purchased at first by a French fur trader by the name of Charbonneau, who then marries her and brings her in as one of his many wives.
And she was a very young girl at that time, about 15 or 16 years old.
About 15 or 16 years old, that's right. And by the time that Lewis and Clark met her, she is just turning about 17 years old, and she's pregnant with her first child. And what really is a remarkable story is that, of course, when Lewis and Clark show up, that's going to be an amazing thing for all of the Indians in the Mandan village. But what they're going to do is they're going into an area where, as they already have been, going into a space where no American has ever been before. They don't know the people. They don't know the landscape. It is literally the Corps of Discovery. But they need somebody that's going to help them talk to all the people that they're going to be meeting from this point forward. The tribes they've met so far, they've known about, but they have no idea what lays beyond. And fortunately, they find out that Sacajawea is a woman from that space, and they desperately want her help.
What are some of the profound things that are really recorded in history that she was able to assure the success of their mission? They would have not been able to survive without her in many instances, and some of the unique things. Can you share some of those highlights with us, Mike?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I mean, it's remarkable that as she agreed to go, she was not forced to go by her husband. She agreed to go with him. She didn't speak English at all. As a matter of fact, she didn't even speak French. Charbonneau had to learn what she was saying, then translate. Then she was able to speak French to the team who also knew French, and then they were able to write English what she was saying. So there was a huge communication gap there. But what really made her remarkable was just the very presence that she had. Of all the peoples that they met, if there was a party of men, armed or otherwise, that was coming across territory uninvited or unknown, it would automatically be assumed that this group would be hostile, and these men of the Corps of Exploration would be finding themselves at war instead of just walking around trying to make friends and meet people. But because she alone was there with that group, that meant that they were not there for war, but just passing through. It was the symbolism of her being with those men that basically told everybody they came across that they were peaceful and they didn't mean any harm. The fact that she had the baby while she was walking with these men across this rugged landscape also added to the fact that this was a peaceful group with peaceful intentions.
Yes, so she carried her son on her back, throughout that entire mission.
Yeah, Jean Baptiste, a little
Yes.
guy that got to see a lot of the country, didn't remember a thing.
Yes.
Uh, but, she did so many other things too. She was remarkable in the fact that she knew the food that could be eaten by the Corps of Discovery as they were going across this new landscape. She also was able to help mend their clothes. Many of them went from the shoes that they had brought from America. Those wore out quickly, so she made moccasins and had ways of mending and keeping the men in good cover and good clothing as they were going across. But also, very significantly, she was very brave in and of herself, leading them to places that she knew that there would be good for food or good for transit across mountainscapes and otherwise. But at even one point, when Charbonneau made a mistake, he dumped one of their canoes inside the Missouri River. She put the baby on the shore and then dove in and saved most of their scientific instruments and writings.
Just imagine that. A young girl, the only female with this group of men, and at the young age of 17, having that kind of connection to all of her surroundings, she really was very profound.
Very profound.
Yeah.
And then her significance gets even stronger. As these men got to the end of the Missouri River and started getting into the mountainous country in Idaho and Wyoming and all these other and Montana, they realized that they couldn't have boats anymore, which has been the way they transited. They needed horses,
Yeah.
and the only people they could get horses from were native tribes. As they were going through and wandering around the mountains in Idaho, they came across a group of Shoshone, and because she was with them again, that basically telegraphed their peaceful intention. But as it would happen, they took them to their chief, and lo and behold, it was Kamawait, who was her brother that was left behind. And they recognized each other, and almost instantly that forged a lasting understanding and alliance and trust between the Shoshone people and the Corps of Expedition or
And
Corps of
and someone
Exploration.
and her brother who she had not seen for years.
Years. Yes,
And that
absolutely.
they had this and it was recorded in the journals. What an emotional moment for her as she made that recognition that she was there with her brother.
Absolutely.
And then her life as they returned and came back, she still, um, in some ways is very mysterious, but all of us are so intrigued with her that there are many variations of where she lived, where she's buried.
Right. And I mean, unfortunately, that happens a lot in history, even
Yes.
more recently than we realize, that sometimes when you have somebody that steps out of the spotlight for a little while, all of a sudden their future and what happened to them becomes extremely nebulous. We don't know. There are several people who think that Sacajawea left Charbonneau at some point in her life and then moved down into the area of the Indian Territories or Oklahoma,
Mhm.
where she met another man. They married, and eventually by the time she got into her late 80s, moved back to the area of Wyoming where she joined her people on the Wind River Reservation.
Yes.
And they believe that she lived to be in her hundreds and may have been buried there.
Yes, there's a marker there on the
That's
Wind
right.
River Indian Reservation designating her burial place. Definitely a woman of interest and making profound impacts on the West during her time frame. But there was also an evolving role of women as the movement of settlement in the West and with the Homestead Act. Talk to us a little bit about some of those women who were
Mm.
really once that the Corps of Discovery opened up the West. What was happening in that era?
Well, after the Corps of Discovery, it became realized what wonderful places there were out here in the West that families in America would want to go. We're all familiar about the stories about the Oregon Trail or the California Trail, or even the Mormons when they left
Yes.
the rest of the United States to go to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Of course, when these families are moving and they're leaving everything they know behind, these are women that are taking incredible risks to take their family and join their husbands wandering across this vast unknown landscape. Well, they know a little bit thanks to the Corps of Discovery, but they have tremendous things that they have to face, whether or not they have food, whether or not they have supplies, fresh water, and then making a trek of almost 2,000 miles on foot in one summer
Mhm.
to go all the way across a landscape that is completely formidable and foreboding and speaks a lot to the character of the women that were willing to take those types of risks.
A lot of fortitude, a lot of courage, but also I think inherently that sat within them was this quest for curiosity, independence, and something for the greater a greater good for their family. And they were committed to doing that as they forged those paths and taking their children and their leaving other family behind. That must have been such an emotional decision to make, but yet maybe a very exciting one too.
Very true. Well, nobody knew what the future held. And
Yes.
it took a great deal of fortitude and strength to know that you're going to be leaving everything you knew behind and had a very good chance of never seeing it again.
Yes. Yes.
And that even happened even when we got the railroad that came through about 20 years after the Oregon Trail was being used. When they built the Union Pacific Railroad through our area, we still had women that were leaving everything behind and going to try and make their living out here in this rather foreboding landscape. And of course, if anybody's familiar with where Cheyenne sits right now, or for Wyoming for that
Yeah.
matter, if you try and tell these people, most of them are farmers, most of them come from that type of a background, and you're going to come out to this area and you're going to try and make a living out of this land, that's already an automatic challenge, and it's going to be a very formidable thing to accomplish.
On a less serious side, we have a saying that the West is not for sissies. And I think really, it took a lot of courage, and they were very brave, and thank goodness that there were those who were willing to lead that. Also, a big part of this time frame in women and the West and shaping who we are as people and our lifestyles was the suffrage movement.
Hmm.
And Wyoming, and as a territory and then as a state, has played a big role and had some key figures in that suffrage movement. And I know you have a great deal of information on several of these women. I'm very intrigued with all of them, but let's go in and shift into that a little bit and tell us about some of the women who were very influential and making a big mark on the women's allowing women to exercise their right to vote. I don't like to say it was granted because I think it was always our inherent right,
Hmm.
but then it was finally recognized.
It certainly was recognized. Well, when Wyoming first got started, it was railroaders, roustabouts, and people that were trying to go ahead, miners, for instance, that were trying to scratch the life out of this landscape. At the same time, women they were frequently left behind initially as their men came out here to do this, and then they had to leave everything behind to join their husbands in whatever they had gotten themselves into. What Wyoming realized as a territory was that with a population, if we were going to become stable, we needed to encourage women to come join us. And it was up to the first Wyoming territorial legislature to recognize that fact. And they not only gave women the right to vote, but they also started protecting women's rights to own property, to have equality in pay and if they were in the education field, in order to go ahead and try and draw these people out to Wyoming and make it much more palatable to them. This was shocking to the rest of the United States because this was something that was not to be done, and it never was done before, even if you had women that were going to places like Oregon or into Colorado or otherwise. But Wyoming saw that need and recognized what they needed to give, like you said, they didn't give it to women, but they recognized that women needed this to be able to make a living.
50 years before the United States passed the suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, here in Wyoming, women were actively working in the suffrage movement to make sure that the Wyoming territorial government passed that suffrage act. And there were some key players that were in there. Certainly Esther Hobart Morris,
Yes.
and a very interesting character. She even has a statue, Wyoming. One of our two statues in Statuary Hall at the U.S. Capitol is of Esther Hobart Morris. But talk to us a little bit about her and her role in all of this.
She was fun. She kind of actually stumbled into women's suffrage movement by accident. It was certainly not her intention when she came out here to the American West. But she followed her husband and her oldest son to South Pass City. And she came just as Wyoming recognized this right. But they also recognized the responsibility that if women are going to be citizens, they also have to start assuming roles that would make them part of the entire society and take charge of this entire environment. And so she was actually one of three candidates, women who were asked to see whether or not they would be willing to be a territorial justice of the peace. And of course, where she is, she's in a rough, tough mining town in South Pass City. And two women thought about it but backed out. But Esther Hobart Morris said yes. She had no formal legal training whatsoever. She was actually a haberdasher. She made hats for men and women back in Illinois before she came out. But she rose to the occasion and did a lot of fantastic things to maintain law and order within South Pass City, basically settling a lot of disputes. She also helped manage the first elections that were going to be held there in South Pass City. So she had her whole family that helped her, but she definitely was on the bench and she was in charge of what was going to be happening.
Well, and she was writing letters and doing a lot to influence or certainly persuade that territorial first I guess they were in their second territorial session. The government was the legislature, the territorial legislature, to encourage them to pass that. I've also read where she had connections to Susan B. Anthony and that suffrage movement that was happening on the East Coast. And so some of that information that she had with her here in the West was certainly providing her information to share with that territorial government.
Indeed, they did. But what a lot of things that happened with her happened after she was a justice of the peace.
Yes.
She served only for a little bit of time, but once she wore that mantle and had that responsibility, all of a sudden she became something that was an icon for women to look up to and recognize that there was potential of what they were able to do. And so she became an extremely important figure within the suffrage movement across the United States.
Well, and overall for women and girls, as the
Absolutely.
first woman to serve as the justice in American history, very profound, and that she had a long history in Wyoming. She continued to live her life out in Wyoming, and you can actually here in Cheyenne
Mhm.
visit the home that she had as her residence here in Cheyenne, or certainly see it. It's well marked.
Well, she certainly had a very important part to play. She certainly involved with Wyoming's becoming a state. She was there. She presented the flag to Francis E. Warren, the 44-star flag to fly over our capital once we became the 44th state of the Union. And she was a very prominent person. Now, it's kind of fun that she's also a prominent person. The fact that she raised and influenced E.A. Slack, who was one of the founders of Cheyenne Frontier Days, was her son.
Yes.
So that was kind of a fun thing too. So she has an important contact and context with our story. It's a great thing to add.
Yes, yes, it certainly is. Another woman who's been very famous in this suffrage movement and has been, as we celebrated the 19th Amendment back in 2019, the 100th um, designation of the 19th Amendment, there was a lot of conversation around the first women to vote and cast votes. And certainly Louisa Swain in Laramie, Wyoming, was cast her vote that day
Mhm.
and plays a role in this suffrage movement too. A strong designee for Wyoming. Talk to us a little bit about Louisa.
Well, she's kind of one of those characters that kind of floats in and makes an important contribution to history and then floats away. When she was in Laramie in 1869, when women were first when women were casting their first votes, when she was here, she was already about 65 years old, and she was basically going to take part in something that everybody across the country was going to see whether or not this experiment was going to work. Voting booths and voting at polling places were considered to be very rough and tough. People would have political arguments, or there could be fights, swearing, all kinds of things. It was basically not a very decent place to go as people were trying to wrangle with this political movement. People didn't know whether or not a woman would be willing to approach something like that. And of course, there were many people that thought that this was not something women should be doing anyway, and no one would take advantage of it. But she did. When the opportunity came out, she was one of the first people that came there to the polling place and put her ballot in. And it's not a secret ballot either. We knew who they were voting for, and she had no problem voting the ticket and putting it in. Of course, this we think this is nothing today, but still she was doing something that had not been done anywhere before. And I don't know if she really realized she was doing it and she was going to be first, but she knew she was part of something that was just getting started.
Yes, if you visit the Louisa Swain House in downtown Laramie, there's interesting documents that would indicate that she was part of an orchestrated plan to be a woman who was there that day, as a woman who was 70 years old, that wouldn't be harassed because of her age and that she was unassuming. It's just really interesting to think about that powerful act that she did that probably took less than 5 minutes,
Right. And she changed the world.
and she changed the world.
She changed the world.
Yes.
And, I think that happens with a lot of people that are involved with history. They don't realize that that simple action, that one thing, is going to cause ripples that resonate all the way up through today and change things across the planet. When she did that, though, it's true. Like you said, they thought there was going to be a possibility of a rough and tumble environment. No, it was perfectly polite. And all of a sudden, all the polling places across Wyoming were incredibly polite as women showed up to the polls across the southern part of the territory. And Bill Nye, who was a reporter there in Laramie, thought that was absolutely remarkable that now polling places, because women were present, were as safe as the post office. If you could even send your daughters there and not have to worry about them hearing or being exposed to the rough and tumble world.
Yeah.
But it made a significant difference. And that, again, it was another example of Wyoming leading the way on demonstrating what was possible.
Well, women, this era of Western movement and why we're recognizing and talking about these women is so important in the shaping of who we are today.
Mhm.
Those threads of early history and the mark that they made certainly has lived on and shaped a lot of things that are happening for women and girls today. I know that there's one other person that we just wanted to talk about a little bit in this, Therese Jenkins.
Right.
Now, this is someone I didn't know a lot about, but then I was intrigued when she was brought up that you brought her up, and I'd love to learn a little bit more.
Well, she's a very interesting one. Well, first, let me go ahead and say before I talk about Therese Jenkins, you might notice that Esther Hobart Morris, Louisa Swain, and Theresa Jenkins, all three, none of them are cowgirls. There are women, but they're not involved with ranching in any way. They're basically people that are transplanting from one community to the next. But they have the same type of fortitude. They're independent. They're people that have strong passions, and they're going to follow and do what they need to do to get things done. Therese Jenkins is an example of this. She came later than the other two women, but not too much later. She came out to Cheyenne when it was still coming down from its Hell on Wheels days, and she came out to marry her husband, Mr. Jenkins, here in Cheyenne. But she noticed as soon as she got off the train, she was pretty much put off by the Hell on Wheels atmosphere that the community had because of all the drinking and debauchery that was there. And so she decided to take it upon herself with her husband and the Methodist Church that was just getting started here in Cheyenne to start a temperance movement here in the state of in the territory of Wyoming. And again, this is a place again that has relied on saloons and other things to lubricate the wheels of society. But she thought of something better, that there was something that was more important, the creation of societies that were law abiding, safer families with lots of potential. And so she, for a good portion of her early part of her life, was a temperance suffragist and was the first official member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union here in the state, in the territory of Wyoming, and then became one of its great leaders. And out of that movement, which was supported almost exclusively by women and their supporters, she became something much more. She became a political advocate for suffrage elsewhere in the United States, but specifically here in Wyoming to make sure that we were going to keep up with what we had already started. She wasn't going to brook any backward steps. And what I really love about her is that she's already vociferous. She's already writing in newspapers, arguing with men about what women's role should be in society. She's not worried about taking on even some of the most powerful scientific minds in journals and otherwise. When she sees something that's in print that she doesn't like, she writes a letter to their editor as a rebuttal. And she's very sharp and very to the point on why women are just as much capable of participating in politics as men and will do a better job in many instances. That's her main thrust. But what really makes her a lot of fun to talk about is when Wyoming was getting ready to become a state, they were getting ready to draft our Wyoming Constitution at the
Yes.
Constitutional Convention. It was brought up that if we're going to be a state, isn't it time for us to be more responsible and we should probably rescind women's right to vote? Nobody else is doing it. When she heard that was being even mentioned on the floor in our territorial capitol building, on her own recognizance, she was 9 months pregnant, went around the town on her own campaign, going house to house, telling the women of Wyoming what was about to happen. And she drummed up a march on the Wyoming territorial capitol building to impress upon the people inside that convention that this was not something we're going to abide. Now, on that very same day that they were going to have this, well, literally, it was basically a march. The women were going to go into the Capitol building, onto the floor of the chambers, and demand that suffrage be retained in the Constitution. She couldn't be there herself because the stress of getting everybody to go, she went into labor and had a baby in the carriage instead, outside,
Outside.
instead of being able to participate.
I think, that is such a phenomenal story. And then if you visit the Wyoming State Capitol in the beautiful restoration that occurred when the Capitol reopened in 2019, you can go into that Judiciary Chamber and read about what happened and the significance of Wyoming as we joined the Union and having that suffrage clause in our Constitution. And
Right.
quite a controversial conversation, but certainly part of this American West. We could go on forever, right?
Oh,
We've
it's
covered
easy to do
almost as
this.
100 years, a century of time, and only able, here in this brief time together to call out these amazing women. There are many more. And certainly, as we go through the next episodes here for this limited series for CFD, we'll be covering many other women as we do that. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. As we conclude our episode, we want to invite you to please join us where we cover the 1895 to 1930 era, better known as the era of the cowgirl. Thank
Part
you.
of Western history, a legend walked and talked.